Ahoy! This is a bit outside of my usual territory, but I thought the developments that are happening with Helldivers and Sony at the moment are so interesting that they are worth talking about here. If you've been following along with Helldivers 2's release, then you may be aware that the game initially had quite a few issues regarding the servers, people not being able to play, but then got extremely positive reception and was the most popular new game in the recent month. And then somebody involved in this game's publishing decided to take all that goodwill, put it on a truck and send that truck off a cliff. They decided that in the future Helldivers 2 would only be accessible through a PSN, a PlayStation Network account, which you would have to create, and then that would allow you to log into the game. Now, first of all, that means you have to give Sony your information, your data, which people don't like. Second of all, it means you have to do a form of login beyond the login, which people also don't like. And most importantly, it gates the game from being available in countries where PSN is not available. This means that the plan here was to make the game unavailable in over 100 countries. Now you may rightfully be wondering why they are doing that. The original plan for Helldivers 2 was to require the PSN login, but what I mentioned earlier, the server issues, actually resulted in them not going through with that in the beginning and deciding, okay, we're making the login as easy as possible with as little steps as possible so that the login servers work as best as possible, and in order to do that, they disabled the PSN part of that. The issue with it is that along with that, they also allowed the game to be purchasable in countries that don't have PlayStation Network access, so the access would basically later be revoked. And honestly, we gotta give Sony props here, because what they managed was a small miracle. They managed to bring gamers from all kinds of different beliefs together. Because those gamers very universally agreed that this was a bad decision, and they let Helldivers 2 hear it. Arrowhead's CEO acknowledged this and stated that it's warranted, apologized for it and said that they would try to make up for it and regain trust by providing a continued great game experience. Of course, a tweet like that is not enough, and the reviews tanked further after that. It even went so far that Helldivers 1 got a bunch of negative reviews, even though it was not part of the whole PSN thing at all, which is something that is obviously not fair, but also shows just how upset people were. The CEO then said they are talking solutions with PlayStation, especially for non-PSN countries, and all voices have been heard, so things were kinda looking maybe a bit better. But he also stated that he did not have the final say, because obviously he is not Sony, and Sony was ultimately in charge. At the same time, the whole region thing initially went through, and Helldivers 2 was removed from 177 countries on Steam. With all this negative backlash, you may be wondering why Sony was even still insistent on this in the first place, and why they didn't just pull back immediately when they saw the first negative reviews coming in. And while we of course don't have any direct insights into their motive here, it is very likely that they wanted to boost the PSN usage numbers through the accounts using it through Steam, which they can then show to their shareholders and say, look, we've got so many more numbers. And as we know, in the shareholder world, bigger numbers are always better, so it would have been a good point for them to flex with. You'd of course have to entirely disregard the context of this being Steam players that are just forced to use this login, and they'd have nothing to do with PlayStation otherwise, but Sony likely wouldn't really care about that, and many shareholders would likely not be aware of that, so number boosts would have still been very beneficial for them. And the whole shareholders deciding the fate of a game is definitely nothing new anymore these days, especially since Cyberpunk. I think everyone is aware of that. But the story has a happy ending, not so much for Sony, but for Helldivers players. Today, PlayStation announced that they have heard the feedback on the account linking update and will no longer go through with it. The best part is at the end here though, I quote, "We're still learning what is best for PC players, and your feedback has been invaluable." As if one of the biggest gaming companies in the world would not have the resources or research to find out what their target demographics want. Surely you have some people employed specifically for that for a very long time. But this reversal on the decision affects multiple things. First of all, I'd like to point out something specifically from the announcement that is very interesting in hindsight. They stated, "Account linking plays a critical role in protecting our players and upholding the values of safety and security provided on PlayStation and PlayStation Studios games. This is our main way to protect players from griefing and abuse by enabling the banning of players that engage in this type of behavior." Or is it? Because the fact that they're now able to revert this decision shows us that apparently all of this wasn't necessary after all, and they will probably have different means to deal with that. So this claims one thing, but the actions that they gave us now show us the opposite. I believe that's very relevant because effectively that's breaking trust. The company claims that a specific feature needs to be introduced for a game to work or specific parts of the games to work, and then suddenly it turns out that that was never the case. Kind of questionable. We have very similar situations with certain tools that are utilized to prevent early cracks of games, which usually result in the game getting cracked sooner or later anyways, but also often hinder the performance of the game. The worst part of this is that the brunt of the negative feedback is going towards Helldivers 2 and to the devs and everyone who is actually involved with the game, who have very little influence on the decisions that Sony made on a higher level. I'm sure that a fair few people will revert their negative reviews, but I'm sure it's by far not all of them, and this will just stick to Helldivers, and it will also stick to Helldivers history effectively. People will remember this part of what happened with the game, often likely without putting it in the context of who is responsible for it. For example, to this day, many people associate New World with destroying graphics cards, and some returning players will ask if New World still destroys graphics cards, when it has been confirmed ages ago that this was a defect with one specific graphics card, and the company behind that has stated as such. So to me it really feels like Helldivers 2 is taking the fall for Sony's decision here, and that's just extremely rough for the people behind it who were simply trying to make a good game. I would say I hope Sony's shareholders learn their lesson from this, but my impression is that they're gonna just try and see how they can push the boundaries in the future again and again, as it usually happens in the corporate world. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and thanks to my patrons for supporting this video. Duke Sloth, out.